Good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Halbrook. I am a director at Gridworks, and I'm here to talk about the tactical gas decommissioning and targeted electrification project that we are a part of. I'll go through three categories of information today. The first is I'll give you an overview of our project. I'll then share some of our progress to date, and then also some of my thoughts on where I see the opportunities for local governments interested in engaging in these issues. So before I get to the information that's of interest to all of you, a quick shameless plug. Gridworks is a nonprofit that convenes, educates, and empowers stakeholders working in decarbonization. We love facilitating difficult conversations. So if any of you are interested in our support on some of these challenging topics, please let me know. So as I mentioned, Gridworks is part of a tactical gas decommissioning project funded by the California Energy Commission. This is the Northern California portion of the project. There is also a Southern California contingent run by RAND Corporation in partnership with the Southern California Gas Company. Some of my colleagues on this project are here in the audience today. Ari from Energy and Environmental Economics. And we have East Bay Community Energy as well. Allison, hello. And PG&E, David Sawaya's team as well. Really stellar group. Our project has four key objectives. The first is to develop a replicable framework to identify sites for gas decommissioning that could support gas system savings. That's really important, and we'll get into that today. We're not just looking to decommission any gas pipe just for the greenhouse gas emissions benefits, really looking at opportunities to reduce some of that rate pressure that David was mentioning in his presentation. The next is to apply that framework to locations within PG&E and EBCE's shared service territory, and to eventually whittle the list down to 3 pilot sites, including at least one in a disadvantaged community. The next is to engage local communities to hear their perspectives and priorities on the topics of gas system decommissioning and targeted electrification. And then lastly, to produce deployment plans instructing on how you would implement these pilots. So the first is our site selection framework. In terms of our progress to date, this is fairly established. At the end of my presentation, I have a link to a series of blog posts that Gridworks has published in partnership with E3, EBCE, and PG&E on many of the topics that I'll present today, including this site selection framework, and you can read more there. We'll also eventually be publishing a final report as well. So the first is the candidate screen. As I mentioned, we're looking for sites where gas system decommissioning could achieve gas system savings. So the proxy we used for that is determining that there's a high likelihood of a near-term capital project, that PG&E has some plans for a capital outlay for repair or replacement of the gas system, but not too soon. And that's really important. We think it will take some time to identify sites and implement projects. So we probably can't avoid a near-term capital project in the next year or two. So we wanted to look out a little bit further. Then the next is this term you see on the screen called hydraulic feasibility. And what that means is that decommissioning this portion of the gas system wouldn't have an impact on service for remaining customers in terms of pressure, et cetera. And so PG&E has a fairly extensive tool that's used to assess hydraulic feasibility. We didn't want to ask them to run that for every location in PG&E and EBCE's shared service territory. So we came up with our own little proxy before we passed a more abbreviated list along to them that was looking basically just at portions of the gas system that are at the end of the line. We call that a terminal branch. So we then passed along sites to PG&E, and they used their gas synergy model to confirm our assessment of hydraulic feasibility. Two really important things here are PG&E's gas asset analysis tool, which David mentioned earlier, as well as their synergy gas model. I really want to express that I think it's pretty rare for gas utilities, one, to share this kind of data, to have it compiled in a central location, and to have it in a usable format. I don't think our project would have been possible without that. So as we all focus on where we can advocate for state policies, I think this is a really important one, is for gas utilities to have this kind of information compiled and in a usable format. These GIS layers that PG&E has compiled makes it really user-friendly. Then lastly, we kind of have our list of feasible sites where it is, from an engineering perspective, we can decommission these portions of the gas system without impacting remaining gas customers. And there is an opportunity to avoid some gas system investment. We then went through site prioritization. Now, in an ideal world, anytime you see, hey, this project is cost effective and feasible, we should do that project. For our purposes, this being a research initiative, we were, again, I'll remind you, tasked with identifying 3 pilot sites. So we went through a process to prioritize locations. We looked at the potential for gas system costs, electric system costs. We also, again, being a research project, wanted to prioritize diverse building types so that we could learn what is it like decommissioning gas for suburban single-family homes versus multifamily dwellings versus restaurants. So we really prioritize that in our process. And then wanted to look at what are the community priorities and the presence of a community champion that could help us with this eventual implementation. So I want to share some numbers here that I think are really important. So 14 sites emerged from that preliminary candidate screen, and only 11 sites remained following the engineering review. Now, if we think about that, that's a really small number of sites for all of PG&E and EBCE's shared service territory. That means we think that there's some ways to change those numbers and to bring them up. We'll be sharing some of our lessons learned in our final report, as well as in an upcoming blog post about why we think those numbers were really limited. But I think that scale is important to acknowledge. Much of it at this point, we think, is largely due to the planning cycles we see in gas utility spending, where those are limited to the 3-year general rate case planning cycle. So then, as I mentioned, of these 11 feasible sites, we'll be developing deployment plans for one of each of the following categories, again, really focusing on optimizing for diverse building types. So we'll be looking at one in an Oakland disadvantaged community, another site that would focus on mixed building types in East Oakland, and then another focused on a suburban single family. We also found that for our purposes, we're assuming that electrification of buildings is already going to happen. It's part of that counterfactual, right? The state and local governments all see building electrification as a key part of reaching their greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. So it's important to say we're not assuming that these gas decommissioning projects are somehow triggering additional spend that's needed for building electrification. So the next is our community engagement approach. And I think David alluded to some of this, as did Becky, who was involved in our project when she was formerly at EBCE. So we initially intended to work with some trusted community leaders who understand those unique local needs of the people and the environments in which we're looking to implement pilots. So this began with some compensated interviews for 2 community-based organizations, or CBOs, to gather some feedback on our community engagement strategy. We also interviewed members of our project's technical advisory committee who have experience in this space. Shout out in particular to Billy Romaine from the city of Berkeley, who's done a lot of this work and been really helpful for our project. Based on some of the feedback we received from these interviews about the importance of transparency, we decided to launch an RFP, a request for proposals, to more formally engage CBO partners. They were going to help us develop some site-specific community outreach strategies, implement those strategies, and summarize some of the results. We were offering $120,000 in total funding to anywhere from 1 to 3 CBO partners, basically about $40,000 per site. EBCE promoted this solicitation by directly communicating with CBOs through their email listservs, reaching over 100 organizations, as well as individuals and organizations we've reached out to over the course of our project. EBCE also sent some follow-up emails, but unfortunately, we actually didn't receive any responses to our RFP. And no one even attended the webinar that we plan to host for interested bidders. We think that this is a really interesting finding that highlights a lot about this kind of work and the many other priorities community-based organizations have, and helps perhaps dispel this myth that money alone, you can throw money at the problem and it will fix it. You know, I think Becky had that quote around communities move at the speed of trust. And so we'll be sharing some of our lessons learned. We as a project team have been reflecting on why might this have been, and trying to talk with others in this space, because the community engagement is a really important part of this work. And even the CPUC staff proposal out there relies heavily upon community champions to implement gas decommissioning and targeted electrification work. I should also note that perhaps one reason here is our project ends with the development of deployment plans for these 3 pilot sites. We actually don't have funding to implement them. We would love if all of you want to step up with your checkbooks, and we'd love to find ways to hand off this work to others who might be able to fund implementation, either alone or in partnership with others. So the project team embraced this opportunity to perhaps pivot a bit on community engagement and really meet communities where they are and to draw upon some of our lessons learned. So we have this new 2-pronged approach to community engagement that's up on the screen. We'll be co-hosting some events with the cities of Oakland and San Leandro. The city of Oakland has been a really great partner in this project, offering us a lot of advice and the opportunity to work with them on these town halls. So a big thank you to Sheena in particular. And what we'll be doing is tagging on to some of their existing building electrification work, which will hopefully reduce community fatigue and increase participation. The town halls are really intended to provide some educational materials on building electrification, gas decommissioning, and some related topics. We'll be sharing information about our project and answering questions. This is also an opportunity for all of us who are attending these events is to learn a little bit more about where interest in building electrification and gas decommissioning lie. We'll then be working on some focus groups. We've hired a regional environmental justice organization to help us lead these, and we'll plan to form a handful of these focused on gaining certain information. So our next piece that's currently under development is these deployment plans. They're intended to be sort of the instructions for how you would implement one of these gas system decommissioning and targeted electrification pilots. They'll include a fair amount of content around near and long-term goals for these sites, what some of the costs might look like, workforce needs, etc. And so lastly, I want to go to what I see as some of the opportunities for local governments. I think this event and the participation from many of you indicate that local governments in the Bay Area are really advanced. You're pushing this topic, and I think the recent progress around REACH codes is really what drove a lot of the conversation at the state level, in fact, not the other way around. So I think local governments play a really important role here. You have jurisdiction around building codes, zoning, and permitting. And I think to echo some of what my colleague said earlier this morning, really focusing on all electric new construction, right? Not making the problem worse is a super important place to start. And then promoting targeted electrification rather than that scattershot electrification that David was mentioning, and this is a very similar image to what he had. And then requiring exploration of alternatives to repair and replacement of gas infrastructure. I would also encourage, considering municipal buildings as an opportunity for demonstration and examples of leadership. The San Joaquin Valley Disadvantaged Community Pilot, one of the findings from that was it was so important for people to have trusted community members to go to who already had electric appliances in their homes. So to be able to see the city government leading on that and to go and interact with those appliances and to ask questions could be a really great opportunity. I think based on what we've seen around community-based organizations, it's really important for local governments now to build and strengthen existing relationships with CBOs, groups, and organizers to understand where their priorities are in these issues, where they might be interested in combining these topics with, say, what was mentioned earlier around energy efficiency and other healthy homes kind of projects and initiatives. And then really encourage all of you to leverage and build new coalitions around advocating for changes to state policy. I mentioned the one on data access, and then also around the obligation to serve. So that's it from me. Again, here on the screen are links to our prior blog posts and an opportunity to stay informed of future blog posts and publications of our reports. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire.